So here's a hard truth. Sometimes forgiveness isn't healing. Sometimes forgiveness is used like a hammer, clean, polite, and devastating. Have you ever been in a situation where someone hurt you, like deeply hurt you, and before you could even catch your breath, they tossed out a quick, "I'm sorry," and expected everything to go back to normal? No ownership, no change, just sorry. And when you didn't immediately accept it, you became the problem. You were holding a grudge. You were being too much. It's what I want to talk about today, because there's a kind of forgiveness that's not about healing. It's about control. It's about shutting people down. And I call that toxic forgiveness. We've confused apology with resolution. Research shows that for a true apology to be effective, it needs to come with empathy, responsibility, and here's the big one, change. When someone says, "I'm sorry," but nothing changes, that apology becomes a tool to end the conversation, not repair the relationship. And that's not brave, that's avoidance dressed in politeness. And let me tell you, I've seen this play out more times than I can count in interviews, in data, in my own life. Someone says something deeply hurtful or they cross a boundary you've clearly communicated. And when you confront it, nervously, probably shaking a little, they go, "Okay, well, I said I was sorry." Like that's a get out of jail free card. But apology, real apology, is not a performance. It's not a script. It's a moment of vulnerability, and it takes guts. What we're seeing instead, especially in close relationships, is what I call shortcut apology. It sounds like, "I'm sorry you feel that way," or "I said sorry, what more do you want?" And the second you try to talk about the impact, the walls go up. You're now the one making things hard. You're overreacting. This kind of apology isn't about owning harm. It's about ending discomfort. It's about them feeling better, not you. Here's what the research tells us. A genuine apology has 3 parts: acknowledging the harm, expressing remorse, and committing to changed behavior. That last part, yeah, it's where most people drop the ball. Because change means effort. It means sitting with the reality that you hurt someone and being willing to grow. And that's not comfortable. That's not tidy, but it is where trust is rebuilt. And without accountability, "I'm sorry" becomes a reset button for the offender, not the person who was hurt. It's a way to bypass the slow, uncomfortable process of repair. And when you've been on the receiving end of that kind of apology, you know exactly how it feels. It's like being told to accept a refund for something that cost you so much more than money. And the thing is, we've made it socially awkward to ask for accountability, especially if you're a woman or someone who's been conditioned to keep the peace. Speaking up about repeat harm gets labeled as dramatic. But let me say this as clearly as I can. You are not being ungrateful or unforgiving for wanting change attached to an apology. And yet so many people weaponize the idea of forgiveness by offering hollow apologies and then demanding closure on their terms. That's not healing. That's emotional manipulation. And when we teach people, especially kids, that forgiveness should be automatic after someone says sorry without looking at behavior change, we're not teaching compassion, we're teaching compliance. Real healing starts when we stop using apology as a Band-Aid for pain that needs stitches. When someone says, "I'm sorry," what they're really saying, if they mean it, is, "I see how I hurt you and I'm willing to do the work so it doesn't happen again." Anything less, that's not an apology. That's a silencer. So when we talk about forgiveness, we have to ask, are we being invited into healing or pushed into silence? There's this social script, especially in families or close relationships, where forgiveness is expected immediately, even before the hurt is processed. And when you don't offer it right away, you're labeled as bitter or difficult. But healing isn't linear, and forcing forgiveness before someone's ready doesn't make things better. It makes them silenced. Silenced people don't heal, they hide. And let me just pause there for a second, because that last part, people don't heal when they're silenced. It's one of those truths that sits heavy. I've talked to so many people, men, women, teenagers, leaders, who carry around a kind of quiet shame, not because of the hurt itself, but because they didn't forgive fast enough for someone else's comfort. What I've come to understand through both the data and sitting knee to knee with folks is that there's a huge difference between forgiveness and appeasement. We often confuse the two. We pressure people to forgive not because it's the right time for them, but because we're uncomfortable with the conflict. And that's where the emotional gaslighting comes in. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's incredibly subtle. It sounds like, come on, they said they were sorry, or you're still upset about that, or aren't you supposed to let it go by now? And suddenly the person who was hurt is now on trial. Not the person who caused the pain, but the one who's still feeling it. This is where it gets messy, especially in communities, workplaces, even faith spaces where forgiveness is held up as the highest moral ground. And don't get me wrong, I believe in forgiveness. I believe it can be a powerful act of liberation. But what I don't believe in is weaponizing forgiveness as a shortcut to emotional resolution. Because when forgiveness is demanded before someone has had the space to even make sense of their pain, it becomes a tool of shame. It teaches people that their emotions are too much, that their boundaries are inconvenient, that their healing needs to be rushed for the sake of group harmony. And y'all, that's not healing. That's emotional conformity. That's shame in a Sunday dress. And here's the thing. I've learned that healing is not a timed race. It's not neat. It doesn't unfold in a perfect arc. It's jagged and slow and sometimes incredibly inconvenient for the people around us. But that doesn't make it wrong. That makes it real. What people need when they've been hurt isn't pressure to move on. They need space. They need time. They need their pain to be witnessed without being managed. Because when you create room for someone's pain without rushing them into forgiveness, that's when trust starts to grow. That's when something new and strong can be built. We don't have to force closure. We can hold space for it. And that requires the courage to sit in discomfort longer than we're used to. So if someone's not ready to forgive yet, maybe the most loving thing we can do isn't to push, but to pause. To say, I'll walk with you through this at your pace. Because real love doesn't demand speed. It honors the process. This one hits hard, especially for those of us who grew up equating being kind with being quiet. True forgiveness doesn't mean staying in harm's way. It doesn't mean tolerating repeated behavior. Boundaries aren't barriers to forgiveness. They're the pathway to it. They're how we protect the dignity of the relationship and ourselves. And let's just name this. We live in a culture that often confuses boundaries with being cold, rude, or unloving, especially when it comes to forgiveness. I've heard stories, and I've lived a few, where someone forgives too quickly, too easily, because they believe that's what good people do. They push aside their anger, dismiss the pain, and convince themselves it's over, even when it isn't. That's not resolution, and that's self-erasure. And when we do that, when we offer forgiveness without holding any line or consequence, we're not actually choosing healing, we're choosing peacekeeping. We're trying to restore harmony on the outside while sacrificing our integrity on the inside. That's not compassion, that's survival. I remember talking to someone who said, if I put up boundaries, I'm afraid I'll lose the relationship. And I said, but what kind of relationship are you keeping if you have to disappear in order to maintain it? Because the truth is, boundaries are not the opposite of forgiveness. They're the evidence that forgiveness isn't a free-for-all. They say, I can choose to release resentment, but I will not abandon myself to keep you comfortable. Let me be clear, forgiveness doesn't mean reunion. It doesn't mean you have to call them back or let them in again. You can forgive someone and still keep your distance. You can forgive and still say, this behavior isn't welcome in my life. In fact, the most authentic forgiveness often comes when we give ourselves enough distance to breathe, to reflect, and to reconnect with what we need in order to feel safe and whole again. Research shows that people who have clear boundaries experience less resentment and more sustainable, meaningful relationships over time. Because boundaries don't just protect you, they protect the connection itself. They provide the framework for trust. They allow you to say, I'm here, but not at the expense of myself. And I know setting boundaries can feel terrifying, especially when you've been trained to people please or taught that your needs are too much. But here's what I've learned. The people who respect your boundaries are the ones who were never entitled to walk over them in the first place. And the ones who get angry when you draw a line, they're the ones who benefited from you not having one. Forgiveness, when done without boundaries, isn't noble. It's a slow erosion of your worth. And you deserve more than that. You deserve forgiveness that includes your voice, your values, your truth. So the next time you're told to forgive and forget, I hope you remember this. Forgetting is not a requirement for healing, and forgiveness without self-respect is just another form of surrender. I've spent decades studying vulnerability, and I can tell you it's not weakness, it's courage. A real apology makes space for discomfort. It says, I hurt you, and I'm willing to sit in that discomfort with you. And on the other side, forgiveness says, I'm willing to open myself to healing, but not at the cost of my self-respect. And let me just say, this is where it gets tender, because we like to think that forgiveness is just about the person who's been hurt and apology is just about the one who did the hurting. But real healing, it happens when both people are willing to be vulnerable. That's when something meaningful shifts. We've got this cultural habit of treating apology like a transaction. Someone says, I'm sorry, and we're expected to respond with, it's okay. Even if it's not okay, even if our heart's still bruised, even if we're still processing. And it turns the whole thing into this weird, rushed exchange instead of the human, sacred experience it's meant to be. Apology is not just about clearing your conscience. It's about acknowledging someone else's pain and staying with them in that moment, even when it's uncomfortable. When someone offers a genuine apology, it takes vulnerability. I mean, really think about it. They're putting their pride on the line. They're saying, I messed up, and I care enough about you to admit that. But for that to matter, it has to be more than words. It has to be embodied. I always say, look for the pause. Look for the part where they stop talking and start listening. That's where remorse lives. That's where the repair begins. But here's the other side of the coin that doesn't get talked about enough. Forgiveness also requires vulnerability. It doesn't mean rolling over or forgetting. It means opening yourself, maybe just a crack, to the possibility of healing. And that's scary, because to forgive means we have to feel. We have to go there. We have to revisit the pain in order to release it. And for a lot of us, that's a risk we're not always ready to take, and that's okay. What I've learned is that vulnerability is not about oversharing or being unguarded all the time. It's about truth-telling. It's about showing up fully human, even when we're scared. And when both the person apologizing and the one being asked to forgive are willing to sit in that raw, honest space together, that's where reconnection is born. That's where trust starts to rebuild, not in the perfection of the moment, but in the realness of it. There's no magic phrase, no tidy script. Real apology is messy. Real forgiveness is hard. But when both sides lean into vulnerability, When someone says, I'm here, I see you, I won't run from this, and the other says, I'm hurt, but I'm still here too, something powerful happened. That's not weakness. That's bravery at its highest form. Not every story ends in reconciliation, and that's okay. Some people will never take responsibility. Some wounds aren't meant to be reopened. Forgiveness doesn't mean inviting people back in. Sometimes it means releasing the burden of resentment while holding firm to your boundaries. That's not cold. That's clarity. And if we're being honest, like really honest, that kind of forgiveness can be the hardest because we are wired for connection, we're built to belong, and there's a part of us that wants to believe that every relationship can be healed if we just try hard enough. But some people don't want to do the work. Some relationships are built on patterns that exhaust us, diminish us, or make us feel like we have to contort ourselves just to stay connected. That's not love. That's emotional labor in disguise. I've talked to people who say, but if I forgive them and still keep my distance, isn't that holding a grudge? And my answer is always the same. No, that's not holding a grudge. That's holding a boundary. See, we've been sold this myth that forgiveness means reconciliation. That once we forgive, the slate is wiped clean and we go back to how things were. But for a lot of us, going back isn't safe or healthy or even possible. Forgiveness doesn't always lead to reunion. Sometimes it leads to release. A release of the hope that they'll ever understand. A release of the fantasy that this time will be different. A release of our need for closure from someone who's never been capable of giving it. And that release, it's not about them, it's for us. Because carrying the weight of unspoken pain or waiting for someone to change who keeps showing you they won't, that's like drinking poison hoping it'll make the other person sick. Forgiveness from a distance says, I don't need to keep bleeding to prove I've healed. It's an act of liberation. It's not cruel, it's courageous. And let's be real, there's grief in that choice. Grief for the version of the relationship you wanted, for the apology you may never hear, for the connection you fought hard to preserve. But in that grief, there's also a quiet kind of power. The power of saying, I choose peace over proximity. I choose truth over illusion. What I know for sure is this: forgiveness doesn't mean you don't still feel the sting. It just means you're not letting that sting define you anymore. You're not organizing your life around the ache. You're making space for joy, even if the person who hurt you isn't there to see it. So yes, sometimes the bravest, most honest, most life-giving form of forgiveness is one that happens quietly. Without a reunion, without a big conversation. Just a choice made in your own heart, in your own time. I'm done carrying this. And that's enough. So here's the truth. Forgiveness is not a performance. It's not a script we read to make other people feel better. It's not a fast pass to avoid the hard conversations or a shortcut to emotional resolution. Forgiveness is deeply personal and deeply sacred. It is a process, not a demand. And when we strip away the pressure, the shame, the obligation, we find something real underneath. The freedom to heal on our own terms. We've been taught that forgiveness always means letting people back in. But sometimes real forgiveness is drawing a line. Sometimes it's saying, I wish you well over there. Sometimes it's letting go without needing to be understood. And that doesn't make you hard, that makes you whole. Remember, you are not difficult for needing time. You are not cold for needing space. You are not broken because someone else refused to change. Forgiveness does not ask you to disappear. It asks you to reclaim yourself, to find peace without abandoning your truth. So if you're navigating forgiveness right now, whether it's with someone else or even with yourself, go gently. You're not late. You're not wrong. You're human. You don't have to carry what's not yours. You don't have to accept I'm sorry as a substitute for change. And you don't have to confuse silence with healing. Take your time, trust your gut, set your boundaries, and remember, real healing honors your dignity first. Good luck. You've got this.